child. I think he was 2 months old when he got this message. We got this message, but I was more thrilled with the opportunity again to go live internationally and as a continuous improvement practitioner to really go learn about the Toyota production system and Japanese culture from the source. Right after we found out about this opportunity, I happened to be at a conference speaking, and Mr. Yoshino also happened to be at the conference. It was complete coincidence. And we had a chance to meet, and he gave me his business card and said, when you arrive in Japan, look me up and I will take you to Toyota and we can spend the day together talking. And this was very exciting for me. And I knew at that point it was going to be a wonderful experience for me as well. So this picture you see right now is actually the very first time we met up in Japan. This is the picture outside of the Nagoya train station in Japan. And I was living in, my husband and I and our children were living in Tokyo. So it's a 90-minute, very quick bullet train journey. And I made my husband take the day off of work as well, because I really did think this was going to be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So here we are on this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that has now turned into be part of one of the most important relationships in my adult life. And this is Mr. Yoshino in the middle. And yes, indeed, we went to Toyota City and went to the Toyota factory and had a chance to walk around. And we spent the day together. And I just started writing a blog. I wanted to not only take this opportunity to learn for myself, but also to share what I was learning with other people. And Mr. Yoshino said that I could write about anything that we talked about in our discussions. I could share publicly on my blog. And so this became sort of our pattern of our relationship. About every 2 months, I would jump on the bullet train and we would spend the whole day together, sometimes going to some other museums, but oftentimes just going and spending time in his university office, talking and having lunch and learning together and having really good conversations. And when my family and I moved back to the United States about 1.5 years after our time in Japan, Mr. Yoshino and I continued to collaborate around the world. He has come and stayed at my house, and we've done many different workshops and talks, both in the United States and in Europe. And then out of this, we thought, let's write a leadership book. And as I was doing the interviews with Mr. Yoshino, I realized that the richness of his experience of both being a learner from the very early days of when he joined Toyota, all the way to becoming a more senior executive leader as a vice president, was really an important journey, not only to share the history of some important times in Toyota, but also how each of us can grow as leaders, both through success, but also through failure. And one of the things that I was really interested in exploring with him was the secret behind Toyota. Many people looked at Toyota as this sort of perfect company, or this real excelling at people development and at leadership and at production. And he told me one time that the only secret to Toyota is its attitude towards learning. And I think this is really important for us to take on, because often we focus on tools and forms and techniques, which are important for improving process, but really it's how it is achieved its success is a focus on people and a focus on learning. So if we can be thinking about that for each of ourselves as people, as leaders, and as organizations, we are then really going to be able to pull in the tools that we need that really focus on the learning. And this is a picture of Mr. Yoshino and myself actually in Japan in January, right before the pandemic hit the whole world. I'm really glad that I had a chance to go out there and spend some time with him. I usually lead learning trips to Japan throughout the year. I was planning on doing 2 this year. Unfortunately, they weren't able to happen. But we had a chance to take a picture together, which was great. The sort of the meta story, sort of the bigger story of writing this book too, and as this relates to learning, is that learning happens through reflection and spending time and looking back and really understanding what happened in the past and what actions am I going to take differently. And sometimes we can take a look back, just maybe yesterday or a short time on a project we just did. But what are we looking at the sort of the bigger picture of how we're learning over time? And we may learn things that we didn't anticipate that we were learning before. And so this is a quote that I thought was really special, that he he, a Toyota leader, is even learning new things about his life through this process of working on this book with me as well. So winding back to this very first conference that I met Mr. Yoshino, also talks about how this framework of leadership that I want to share with you today, and will be the frame of the leadership practices that I share with you, and also the leadership practices that I write about in the book. And they're very simple in concept, but much more challenging in practice. So this is a picture of Mr. Yoshino and John Shook, who was at the time the president of the Lean Enterprise Institute in the United States. And John Shook was the very first non-Japanese employee of Toyota in Japan in the 1980s, when Toyota was first starting to expand overseas. And Mr. Yoshino was put in charge of developing the training program for American workers at the Numi plant, actually located just a few miles, 30 miles from where I'm located right now, which was a joint venture between Toyota and General Motors, sending the Americans to Japan to learn the Toyota production system. And he hired John Shook, who was living in Japan at the time, to be to help them understand American culture. So John was reporting to Mr. Yoshino, and he needed to teach John Shook the Toyota production system and the Toyota way of thinking and leading, and so that John could help them teach the Americans as well. And he talked about his role and responsibility as a manager, not just to John, but to anyone who reported to him. And they were on stage, and Mr. Yoshino said this comment, that my role or my aim was to develop John by giving him a mission or target and supporting him while he figured out how to reach that target. And as I was developing John, I was aware I was developing myself as well. And to me, this really is quite profound and simple at the same time, that the role of a leader is to, I usually have another slide, is to set the direction, provide support, and develop yourself at the same time. And so I'm going to talk about those three concepts and share some stories from you that I learned from Mr. Yoshino, and in some practices from my own practices that you can take forward and start implementing and bringing into your life every day. I mentioned that one of the other concepts, and I'm actually in my office right now, I will pull out a Daruma doll. These are from Japan, and they're visual representations of having a goal. This one has not had a goal set in, but when I do, I'll fill in the Daruma's left eye, and it's a visual reminder of something you want to achieve. And it also represents the Japanese saying, fall down 7 times, get up 8. These paper mache dolls are weighted at the bottom. It's on my hand, so I can't really do it right now, but it will right itself up when it falls down. And so this is a reminder to us to also know that achieving goals, both for ourselves personally and for our organizations, doesn't happen right away. We're going to encounter challenges and setbacks, but it's how we get up, how we keep learning and moving forward that's important. And what I really discovered from working with Mr. Yoshino is how Toyota does that very effectively. So they are not perfect, but they learn more effectively, and they keep getting up and they keep trying. Really, that plan, do, study, adjust cycle is quite prominent in everything they do at Toyota. I also mentioned that the word intention is important to me. And while I don't believe that we need to use foreign words in things that we do, I was in Japan and I needed to have a word or a representation, I didn't have a logo on my business cards at that time. And I told the business card company to put the word intention on my card. And this is what it looks like in Japanese in the kanji symbols. And the lower part of this symbol on the left means heart, and the one on the right means direction. And I didn't know this when I asked them to put it on, but I have come to see this concept of intention, about being purposeful in what we do and the actions we take as leaders and as people, to really be about connecting with our heart, what is important to us as humans, as leaders, both on the larger scale and on the small scale. So like, what's your purpose in the moment? And then how do we align our actions in the direction to achieve that purpose? It's a way of staying oriented. Almost you could consider your intention to be your true north, It's the guiding you always in this right direction, and how do you keep reorienting yourself when you fall down? There's another concept in the book that I talk about, and actually is the framework for how I've written. And this was something I discovered through the writing process, and actually just coincidentally reflects back on Toyota's history as a loom company. It was a weaving company in the when it was founded, and the Toyota Motor Corporation part was only founded in the late 1920s. So there's a concept of warp and weft. And warp are those straight, the vertical threads that are laid down on a loom that are constant and known, and they have to be strong and taut to withstand tension. And then there are weft threads, which are the ones that get woven in between. When I was talking to Mr. Yoshino about writing his story, I told him that I was really seeing two strong threads of purpose in his life. One was for him, a clear sense from time he was an early child or a small boy to move to the United States, to live internationally outside of Japan, and everything it took across his life to learn English, to learn Spanish, to learn other languages, and to put himself in a position so that he would have an opportunity in his 40s, finally, to go move to the United States and have this opportunity. And it's really continued to be the foundation of his life fabric. His weft threads, in contrast, were the things he was learning about leading, developing people, and it's through the intersection of the warp and the weft that really the rich fabric of purpose gets to be known. So each of us have different warp and different weft, but I would challenge you or encourage you to think back on what are those things that are known and constant in your life and that keep you going and help give you perseverance in challenging times? And what are the things that you have learned and discovered along the way through success and through failure as well? And really, just like fabric, our own life story is that intersection and the interrelationship between warp and weft. So I want to go back to this foundation of a leader's role, and I'm really looking forward to answering some questions and having some dialogue around this at the end of the session. Around leaders' roles to set the direction, provide support, and develop yourself. So on the first, about setting the direction, we all know that we need to have like a direction or a challenge to move towards, but often, in my experience, in both when I worked internally at organizations and now with coaching and consulting with organizations around the world, more often than not, people in the organization don't really have a clear sense of what the top priorities of the organization are, or even what the clear next challenge or target should be. So this is really the leadership role in telling, in setting the direction, of providing a target, providing clarity in how everyone should orient their creative energy and problem-solving energy towards achieving. I've also found that I learned from this in talking from Mr. Yoshino, as well as my own personal experience, that sometimes we set targets because we think they are achievable, rather than what our customers actually need. Now, for example, I worked in healthcare for many, many years, and I can't tell you how many meetings that I was in where we talked about what's an okay level of harm or error rates for this year, or what's the right sort of reduction in it. Maybe that's okay to have an incremental target for the next step to keep doing plan, do, study, adjust. But really our targets, our big challenge should be what the customer needs. Zero harm, zero errors in this instance. So think about what does your customer need, set that as the higher challenge, and maybe work towards it smaller target by target. But don't let things like bonuses or compensation packages limit what you need to be doing for your customers. And Mr. Yoshino says one of the things that Toyota does very well is set those challenging targets, because getting back to this concept of the only secret to Toyota is its attitude towards learning, is that it's what you learn by not achieving the target, by having a goal out there that he calls seemingly impossible, challenges you to think more creatively and how we're going to get there and how we're going to learn our way through there. So that's where we create that wisdom and get a little bit smarter. Okay, so the second one is around providing support. And this is really the the richness of the stories of Mr. Yoshino's time at Toyota cover so much of how leaders at all levels really created a culture of developing people, of supporting their learning, and creating this people-centered learning culture. And I'm going to share a few ways that he discovered that happening. And it's important to remember, as Mr. Yoshino says, that as leaders, as coaches, we do not control the development of other people. What we can do is provide the conditions for people to learn. And this is something with challenging people and nurturing them. So again, going back to this concept of setting a challenging target, what's pushing them into the little bit of the uncomfortable? It doesn't seem immediately possible. Challenging them to do something else, but also providing support and nurture so that they're not like in the deep end of the pool without knowing how to swim yet. You meet them where they're at and allow them to learn and develop and create capacity and capability and confidence to be able to solve problems and do the work that they're assigned. So one way that leaders do this is to set the conditions for success and take responsibility for when mistakes happen. There's this really incredible story that Mr. Yoshino hadn't even thought of in over 40 years when we first started doing the interviews for this book. And it happened when he was a young man in his early 20s, actually during his orientation at Toyota, when he was assigned a role in the paint shop on the production floor. Even though he was going to have a back-end office job, Toyota really believed that all new employees need to have experience with actually producing cars and what the sort of the value-added work is. And he was assigned to be pouring a can of solvent and a can of paint into a big vat every few hours, and this would be then sprayed onto the cars as they came across the line. And one day, the shop floor manager ran in saying, the paint is not sticking to the cars. And they all looked at Mr. Yoshino, and he was not Mr. Yoshino at the time. He was Yoshino-kun, which means young Yoshino. But he had this sort of moment of panic of, oh my gosh, he realized he had made a really terrible mistake and that he had done something wrong. But instead of yelling at him, they asked him first to show them what he had done. And so he went and got the cans and demonstrated what he did. And then the manager said, "Thank you for making that mistake. We realize now that we did not properly label those cans, and it was easy for you to mistake the cans that you needed. So don't worry, that mistake is our fault because we did not set up the conditions for your work for you to be successful." And he laughed when he told me the story. He said, like, how amazing was that? And it really set forth for him the type of culture, and he was excited to be working in that culture, but also what type of leader he wanted to be. One that didn't immediately blame, but instead looked at process and then realized that it was part of their role as managers to also be setting up a work environment so that people don't make mistakes, at least unintentionally. Managers and leaders also have the responsibility, for teaching the process of learning. So I consider this like coaches and leaders own creating the conditions for learning, but not the learning itself. So this is where, how do we not give all of the answers right away, but give space for people to think and give them some structure for the time to learn. For example, one time, Mr. Yoshino had to create a report. And he had learned from his years before, he's mid-career, probably his mid-late 30s at this time, and he was he was working in the Tokyo office, now in Japan, and he was asked by the head of the Tokyo office to write a report. And he had known that he should go to Gemba, which is a word meaning the place that the work is done or the action happens. So in this case, go and interview some other people from different companies and gather the information from the first source. But he felt like he did not have time. And so instead, he just went to the library. And so he went ahead and stood up in front of the big boss, as he called them, in the big boss's direct reports to give his presentation and summarize his report. And the boss said, "How did you collect your information?" He said, "Oh, I only had time to go to the library." And the boss said, "Stop. You know that that's not the right way to collect information. You need to go talk to people to do the completeness of the thinking. I'll give you one more week. So Yoshino was a bit embarrassed, but he also knew that he was being taught how to learn and how to do things properly rather than just focused on the outcome of the report as well. He later learned, one, that he didn't learn anything new by going out and doing the interviews, and two, that was not the intention of his boss. His boss knew it was unlikely that the information was going to be any different. But what his boss was focused on was teaching him the process of being a better learner, to do a completeness of thinking, and teaching him in some ways how to be a better leader as well. One other thing that leaders and coaches can do is to always stay curious and not assume that our answer is the right answer. So we do this by asking questions and letting people learn. And it's about giving some space for learning. Sometimes we're so busy in our organizations that it feels faster to tell people what we believe to be the right answer. And sometimes we may be right, but we are also limiting creativity and ideas. And if our purpose is also to create a learning organization, so going back to that concept of intention, what are the actions we need to do to align our behavior in creating that learning organization? And one of the most effective ones is asking better questions. So again, and then developing yourself is the third element of leadership. And this is about never stopping learning and growing. So how are you always challenging yourself to be a better learner and a better leader so that you can be more effective in your organization? And I've certainly found that coaching and developing and leading other people is, for me, the best way to develop myself. It's really challenged me to become a better leader. So I have 3 practices, and then we'll open it up for questions. So one, I encourage you to take an intention pause. This can be like 15, 30 seconds before going into a meeting. Help remind yourself of what your purpose is in that one moment, and then what are the actions that you need to take to align yourself. We're going from meeting to meeting that it's easy to fall back into bad habits. Are you the leader in the moment that needs to set the direction and be telling more? Or are you there to help develop somebody else's capability, in which case asking more questions and allowing them time for learning is more effective? Second, pay attention to the quality of your questions. This is a funny looking animal. It's a wolf dressed up as a sheep. More often than not, you'll be surprised if you start paying attention to this. When we think we are asking questions, we are actually advocating for our own idea. It's our ideas with a question mark on it. These are fake questions. Our ideas dressed up as questions, just like a wolf in sheep's clothing. So 2 things you can pay attention for, at least in the English language. Questions that start with what or how tend to be more likely these open-ended questions that you can ask to help someone else's learning that are not interjecting your own thinking. And then the third is to listen openly, not just with open ears, but looking with open eyes, having an open mind, not making assumptions, and an open heart as well. So really looking at the whole person and having compassion and empathy to who they are and where they are in their life as well. And to always remember that failure isn't failure if you can learn something from it, and that learning is never perfect and it's never complete. So out of today, I want you to set your own intention for what you'll practice to become a more people-centered leader as well. And with that, I want to open it up. And there's contact information as well for me here. I'd love to connect with all of you, LinkedIn, Twitter, whatever. And I'll now turn it to Waleed so we can have a few questions as well. So thank you, everyone. I know that was a lot, but it gives us some context for what to talk.
Thank you very much, Katie, for
Thanks, Waleed.
The presentation. And there's a lot to learn from what you've just presented and what Mr. Yoshino has shared, let's say, with yourself, which you're sharing with the world, really. So if anyone has any questions, please use the chat box or the Q&A to place your questions. To start off, basically, you mentioned early when you were talking about reflection, okay? Basically, learning happens when reflection is done. So how often do people do reflection? Your recommendation, is it on a daily basis, or how often? And what sort of type of, well, as you know, some people sit and contemplate and think, some people write. So what, let's say, advice do you have for people to really set the learning in place?
Yeah, so when I work with coach people, I really encourage them to set aside 15 minutes a day for some daily reflection, and not doing it just while you're walking, but really having a more rigorous process of setting out, even for the next day or that morning, what are my intention for today? What am I going to practice? And then how did that go? Because that helps build our muscle and our habits for ourselves in developing that sort of almost the micro plan, do, study, adjust process for our own lives. And so that would be sort of the daily reflection. But then certainly, when we are looking back on a larger project or something bigger, we need to sort of see the totality of everything. But I encourage people not to just look at the outcome and the actions. When we reflect, we really need to go into the assumptions that were made and uncover those sooner, because we often don't bring those to the surface.
Perfect. So you mentioned about the challenge. Let's say the first step is to put a challenge, and it's about what we need, not what we can achieve. Okay. So as you know, there's always people in the organization who would say this is not achievable, it's impossible, you're setting us for, let's say, failure, or it's we can't do it. So how do you handle this type of, let's say, talk or discussions when people come up and say, sorry, it's not going to happen, or they have doubt about the challenge?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I've seen some different ways for this to happen. One is to set that clear challenge. This is our expectation, our longer term goal, and then maybe setting some intermediary steps that feel more achievable, so that people feel like we have success along the way. It's the same way as, always the example of weight loss. You can't, you need to break it down step by step, but to set out, this is where we need to go. This is the longer term direction, and we'll learn our way through there. Another element is also not just telling people this is where the challenge and the support comes in, so that people really feel like their leadership team is there with them, helping them along the way, that they're not just being thrown into the deep end with a challenge without the support and the systems there to help them through the problem solving and the success. And so if you have challenge but no support, or support with no challenge, then it's not going to be, you're not going to achieve what you're wanting to do.
I think this is a very important point where sometimes leaders forget. It's like you set the objective or the target and you say, that's where we need to go.
Yeah,
come on.
Bye.
Right. Yeah. And so it is an important element, the support, and trying to show people how they can, not necessarily telling them what to do, but guiding them and supporting them in that manner, which is the second point that you've just mentioned. Also, you touched on a very important element in your conversation related to the challenge, okay, where sometimes it will happen that people will not hit the challenge, or the organization will not achieve it.
Yes.
Okay. And you gave a great example on, let's say, in Toyota with Mr. Yoshino when he did the mistake. Okay. But what is, let's say, as a leader, and there's a responsibility from shareholders, stakeholders, and all that, if the challenge is not achieved, what sort of reaction do you advise people to act when that happens?
All right. So I think this is a really complex question, and also part of learning is about how do we have learning happen on smaller, less risky levels. So the bigger the challenge, or the bigger the level of importance, especially when it's reaching the customer, the more the more important it is. For example, I even think back to Mr. Yoshino's time where he led this water ski boat business that ended up being a failure, and Toyota lost $13 million, which wasn't huge for Toyota at the time, but still was a big business failure. But they didn't blame him as an individual on this, but they looked at what were the processes across the whole organization that contributed to the failure. So again, it's going back to that, not blaming someone, but also what was the role in engagement of each leader and person along the organization as well, and then understanding, well, what did we do wrong? What were our assumptions that were wrong, and how are we using this as a learning opportunity for the future?
And I think you've mentioned something very important, where you're breaking the challenge into smaller pieces, and maybe that can be like a milestone of seeing where we're going and are we missing it. So are we able to reach, are we going to hit the end goal, or are we short as we're progressing? And this is also can help in that sense of making sure reducing the risk of, let's say, not achieving the target.
Yes, for sure. And be more focused on the process, not just the outcome. And so if we're only looking at the outcome, we're not understanding the things that are going wrong or what we might need to adjust in the process along the way.
You mentioned also from the support perspective, the setting conditions for people to learn and develop and grow. So what are some of the basics that people need to keep in mind when setting conditions? I know that this depends from what is the task, what's the challenge, and depending on the industry you're in. So what are a few of the things that you need to be there so the condition helps people to grow?
So again, as you said, that really depends on each unique situation. The way I like to think about this are how are almost like on the continuum of someone's level of expertise in any one area. So are they a beginner? Are they a novice? In which case you may need to be giving them more teaching and instruction on how to do their job and their work. Do they have the tools available for them to do their job? Either if you're in a manufacturing or physical environment, are the tools there and organized? And have they been trained on how to use them? Have they been taught? As they get more successful in or competent, how are they thinking about things on a bigger picture? How are they problem solving? What questions can you ask them to help encourage their thinking? So again, it's looking at their working environment as well as their capability and confidence in whatever role or assignment that they have, from both doing the task, but also thinking creatively.
Okay, perfect. Our last question is, you spoke about people asking questions rather than giving instructions, and this helps people to grow and also empowers them. If someone, as what you said, you spoke about the masked wolf, basically as a sheep, but a lot of people we're not used to doing this. So and it's quite difficult. It sounds simple, but it's not really easy to develop that, and especially asking the right questions that help people to grow and get the answer. So what would your advice for people to develop that skill from questions?
So I would say just start off with self-awareness. So pay attention to what is coming out of your mouth. If you are asking a closed-ended question, you are actually giving an idea. If you are asking a question with like multiple examples, have you thought of this or that, you're also giving your ideas. How can you reframe whatever question you're asking as something that doesn't introduce an idea, but asks someone to think about it from their standpoint? So like, instead of, have you thought of doing, I don't know, using this paint, you could say, what different paints have you considered for this project? And then you see where the person's thinking and like, where do you need to help them? Are they totally like all over the place and have no idea? Or do they have the answer themselves? That was a very simple example, but always think, how could you reframe a question as a what or a how question that doesn't introduce the answer?
Perfect. So with this, I would like to thank you very much for your time and sharing your knowledge and experience. And I would like to thank all the audience and their questions and their interaction with us. And with this, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Waleed. I really enjoyed it.
Bye.
Bye.